is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Limited Resources. This episode number 467. My name is Marshall. I'm one of your Limited Resources. I am sipping on a fine Arnold Palmer beverage over here. And I know, Luis, you got to have a Madrinas in your hand right now, right? Just the full sellout or what?
So Madrinas is a coffee company that now is sponsoring my stream. And
hashtag sponsored. Hashtag branding. Yeah. I see.
They make a good cold brew, and I've been slamming their cold brews. So it works out pretty nicely when it's something that a product that I can wholeheartedly endorse. I just drink a ton of coffee. So it's not like I'm doing anything that I'd normally do, but they get some publicity. I get some free coffee and a little something. So it works out pretty nicely.
I'm not going to lie. That does seem like a pretty darn good fit for you. Hawking iced coffee. You do know a thing or two about iced coffee, and congrats. That's a cool opportunity. I think that's really neat. I like to see more and more Magic content creators getting sponsored by outside brands as well. I think that's really neat. We're going to be talking Guilds of Ravnica Sealed deck. We had to push off this episode a little bit because of the awkward timing with the Pro Tour being later than it normally would. But we're here. We're ready to help you win your local tournament of PPTQ or whatever it is that you're playing to try to get in there. Before we get into it, our sponsor, channelfireball.com. That's right. The place to go for all things Magic related on the internet. And, this is a company that has sponsored Limited Resources for a long time now, and for good reason. I'm picky. I'm picky about sponsors, just like Luis is. And, there's a few websites that would be on my list, but at the top of it, channelfireball.com. And that's because I can feel good about sending you to them. If you go to Channel Fireball, they're going to get your product to you. They're going to take care of you. They're going to make sure that you're happy. And I know that because I've been a Channel Fireball customer for years, way before we were sponsored by them. And I know what they bring to the table. And that's kind of the bar for me. If you don't meet that bar as a sponsor, then, well, you're not going to hear about it here on LR. So I can wholeheartedly recommend Channel Fireball while you're there. Awesome free content. One of the reasons I really like the site is just because you can go there and you can get this premium level content, and it's absolutely free. You're stopping there like, hey, I'm going to pick up a booster box, and you can watch read Duke Draft or, read an article by Mike Sigrist about the latest draft format or listen to this podcast on there. And I just think that's great value for the listener as well, because that is some top tier content by some of the best players in the world. The show is also brought to you via Patreon. This is a way that you can give back to the creators that help make your life a little better every day, help brighten your day. And if you appreciate it and you think, you know what, these guys are working hard, I like it, I want to give a little something back, patreon.com/limited resources where you can go. And speaking of giving back, I like to do that to our patrons. We've got a playmat giveaway. Boy, I've been giving away one of these and I haven't even dented this stack. So we're buckle in for the long term on this. This one is from GP Omaha, and it's going to John Watts from Burlington, Vermont. Thank you, John, for your support of the show. We really appreciate you being there for us. And I'll put your playmat in the growing pile of to be sent playmats that I have sitting here as well. Let's get a Crack-A-Pack going before we dive into Sealed, Luis. This one comes from our friend Joseph. Thank you, Joseph. What do you want to open, Luis? What's the best thing?
I think the best card to open might just be Niv Mizzet. It's
that's probably true. Yeah. Oh, and that reminds me, by the way, I ordered a box of Ultimate Masters.
Oh, nice.
And what's going to happen is I'm going to give away the box topper thing to a listener, to a random patron. So, yeah, I don't know when that actually comes. I think it's sometime in the middle of December, but I figured I'd get a box so that I can draft with my friends here. But I thought it would be cool to give away whatever we get in the special extended art box topper thing to one of our patrons. So, yeah, it's a lot of value getting becoming a patron of the show. Wishcoin Crab.
Have you heard underrated Wishcoin Crab?
Yeah, you know what's weird? I played this card. I actually played two of them in a draft deck on stream. Oh, and I should mention that too. I've been told that I haven't mentioned this enough. I've been streaming as well for Wizards. I've been streaming Arena on the twitch.tv/magic channel Tuesdays from 2 p.m. to 5 p.m. Pacific. Come hang out. I did a little game review from one of Adam's games and then did a bunch of drafts and stuff too. And I do it every week. People in the chat, they keep thinking or calling it Wisconsin crab, or they keep saying when I see it, I read it as Wisconsin. Has that ever happened to you? Well, I used to see it as Wishcoin, but maybe
I've heard it called Wisconsin crab a lot. So
yeah, it must be a thing.
I think it's just a thing.
Now, we like this card, but
I'm not first picking this card.
Yeah,
but this is one of the cards that I think you get value from, because I'm happy taking it fifth through seventh pick and playing up to 2 in my deck. A lot of people just see it as a blank when it's just definitely not.
I had Invent in my deck and 2 Wishcoin Crabs.
Oh yeah, just take 10.
Oh yeah, boom, 10. All right, this is a card that I would take first if I had to, though I don't think I would be as excited as some people. It's Healer's Hawk.
I think Healer's Hawk is fine. It ended up being, a key part in both Celestia and Boros decks, but yeah. I still think that first picking it or taking it over Luminous Bonds is just not the way to go.
Yeah, I agree.
Look, it's
super
like
solid playable. Yeah.
It's just like what Ben says. People just want to get free drafts. They don't want to win the hard way. And, trying to take Healer's Hawk and just force this like super aggressive deck, I think is not maximizing your equity. I think taking Luminous Bonds, as unexciting as that may be, is actually going to be better overall.
You know what we need to do, Luis? Because you're totally right about it. We need to have Ben back on the show, and we need to get him like really wound up before we start recording about like, oh yeah, people just keep taking, and then just turn on the recording and let him fly. Because that speech, I stand by it wholeheartely, and he loves to give it. So we should.
His first article about draft after many, many years of not writing was drafting the hard way. Like that is all Ben's about,
It's a good article too. Sure Strike. Surely not. Never happened. We'll pretend like that's the case. Hitchclaw Recluse. No. Sumala Woodshaper. I guess this card has just fallen flat because of the guild that it's in, even though on the surface, it looks like it would be a totally fine card. 2 power for 4 mana. Sure, not super exciting, but you're, basically always, most of the time hitting another card off of it. This is a type of card I tend to like a lot. Hasn't really found a home, probably just because I effectively refuse to play Celestia unless forced to by like one of those mythics.
Yeah, and it's not, I think, even that good of a card.
Yeah.
So
sad. It's like, is it just the tempo loss or what? Because things are right for it, right? Like,
well, yes, but basically, like the good Celestia decks. Well, most of the good Celestia decks are about curving out and playing turn 3 Rosemane Centaurs. This just doesn't help, and the extra 2 on body is so irrelevant later in the game. When your game plan is trying to kill them by turn 7, whereas every now and then you get the Celestia deck with just like a bunch of good rares and Conclave Tribunals, and then sure, the Woodshaper is fine. But in the aggressive version of Celestia, is not what you want. Paying 4 mana for card advantage and a pretty small body is not very good.
Yeah, it really just doesn't seem to fit. All right, I like this next card, Hypothesizel. That's the one I would take at this point.
Yeah, Hypothesizel is great. It's just one of the best commons, and it's quite splashable. Taking a first pick Hypothesizel means you can still easily be Grixis as well as Izzet.
Yep. Prey Upon, kind of the default removal spell for green at this point. Should be good in Celestia specifically, but again, I just don't prioritize those type of cards, and then it's probably fine in Golgari. But again, it's just not really.
It's not actually fine in Golgari. It's just Prey Upon is not very good in this format. It's fine with Rosemane Centaur, and it's okay with Siege Room that you're not really looking to play that. Golgari just doesn't have anything that's particularly large except Rhizome Lurker, and that doesn't come out until turn 6 or 7 a lot of the time. So I think that Prey Upon is a marginal card. Like I think it's about as weak as it's ever been here.
Yeah, feels pretty bad, man. Gravitic Punch, no. Dimir Locket, no. Is it Guildgate? Is our last common? No. All right, well, an uncommon could easily upend Hypothesizel. Does this first one. It's Integrity Intervention. So Integrity is the red or a white for +2/+2 on a creature at instant speed, and Intervention is Lightning Helix for an additional 2 mana. So 2 red-white to do 3, and you gain 3 to any target. I don't know.
I think that I would rather just take Hypothesizel to start with.
Part
of it is that Hypothesizel is a little easier to splash in other decks, whereas Intervention Integrity is a Boros card and is an okay splash in Celestia, is not a great splash. It's just okay in those 2 decks because Boros and Celestia are the 2 decks that want to splash the least. Whereas Izzet and Dimir, I think, are pretty high on the list of decks that can splash.
And buy themselves the time to do so.
Yeah, and I'm not talking about putting Hypothesizel in your Boros deck either. I don't think that's a good plan either.
Right. Splashing in Boros is usually bad. All right, here's one that I like better than both. It's Price of Fame.
Yes, boom. Price of Fame is 3 and a black, instant. Kill target creature, surveil 2, and if it's legendary, it costs 2 less. But unless you're killing their Amara or something on turn 2, that doesn't really matter too much. But basically, a 4 mana instant speed deadly visit. That's also splashable. This is great. Like I would always want to start with Price of Fame.
Me too. There's not a lot of uncommons I'd take over it. Our last uncommon, I also would not take over it. It's Legion Guild Mage. So a good card. It's proven solid, but not remarkable, where Price of Fame is kind of remarkable. Well, our last card is our rare, and we wouldn't be taking it if we're sitting at day 2 of GP or whatever, but I think our listeners will be happy that this is going into the pile that gets sent off to a random patron. It's Overgrown Tomb. So, Shockland for green and black. So Price of Fame it is. That's what we're taking. I'll put that in the sleeve, and I might be getting ready to send out here. I haven't checked it in a little while. Okay, let's get into the seal discussion here. I have been jamming a bunch of seals against Adam, and we've been playing actually a few more matches than normal with them, and then kind of re-upping and going through a bunch of packs to try to get a good feel for the format. And I feel like I have one. I made some assumptions going in and then was willing to break from them pretty quickly and decided, no, I think my assumptions were pretty close, which is basically you will not face the streamlined 2-color decks, particularly like the Boros decks, that often. So you're actually free to engineer your deck to maximize on power level and inevitability, these sort of more long-term strategies, which means taking advantage. And this is really critical. This is a big part of what makes Guilds of Ravnica Sealed different than other ones. Taking advantage of the minimum 6 gates you'll get in your pool. That is weird, right? Like you're just getting spotted 6 dual lands minimum, and you might even get like a Gateway Plaza or like a Shockland or something on top of it. And that's just for the lands. On top of that, there's lockets if you need to do that, and they're a little better in sealed, still not great. But this is going to open up a lot of doors for you to play more than 2 colors. And it's working in conjunction with the fact that you're not going to be seeing Healer's Hawk into 2-drop into 3-drop, right? That just doesn't happen very often in sealed. And that means you have a little bit of breathing room from the fun police coming to take away, your long-term strategy before you can get your mana and your good cards flowing underneath you.
Yeah. So, for listeners who've listened to previous sealed episodes, a lot of this, is something that we often say, right? Hey, when you're building your sealed deck, don't build aggressive decks. It's really hard to fill out your curve, and everyone has a lot of removal. Hey, you have a lot more opportunity to play control decks and splash more colors because the games are slower and you're looking to maximize your power. That's all well and good, but I think Guilds takes that and dials it up to like an 11 because this is the most that I've ever seen. It's because not only are the aggro decks worse than I've basically seen in sealed, the control decks and the multicolor decks are the best I've ever seen. Specifically because the commons really support that, and because, like you mentioned, you get a bunch of gates for free. So you end up almost every single time being 3+ color control. Like that's just what you do, and one of those colors should be blue. It's really hard to not play blue in Guild Sealed because blue just has Devious Cover-Up and Disdainful Stroke, both at common, both very, very good. And then like a whole suite of other great commons like Watcher in the Mist, Capture Sphere, Notion Rain is, as a multicolor one, Hypothesis is a multicolor one, and just like this really good fundamental strategy that makes it so that if you're not playing blue, then you often are in trouble.
Yeah, that's totally true. Everything is working towards that. The lack of the other stuff, the fact you mentioned the commons. The fact that this is a gold card set, right? There are some very powerful gold commons and uncommons in this set. And those are in many ways going to dictate where you go in this environment. And you're going to be able to cast a lot of them. And I can really see why they made that uncommon cycle, the color. How do you verbalize
CCDD?
CCDD. Those cards, I can see why.
Because Conclave Cavalier, Night Veil Predator.
Yeah, you just be playing all of them. And even then, you still try to in this. I've had success with Grixis and Sultai, particularly. Those combinations seem to have come together.
Those are the 2 most common.
The ones that have come together the most for me. But I've also stretched it out to 4 colors, and I felt like it was fine. Like, I never really felt like, oh, wow, I really was greedy here, and there's no way I could put...
You don't get to
this is fine.
Put Night Veil Predator and Conclave Cavalier in your deck, but you can play like a Grixis deck, and if you have a couple, you have a Gateway Plaza and 2 Boros Guild Gates, you can splash in a white card as well, like a Conclave Tribunal or a Dawn of Hope or something like that.
Totally. Yeah. And I'll tell you what, you haven't really lived until you've had Crackling Drake next to Night Veil Predator on the battlefield. And you're just like,
I mean, that's a thing you can totally do. Yeah. It's really hard to overstate how extreme this sealed format is. It's not necessarily just compared to draft, because the draft has some aspects of this, but it is definitely a trip how different it is. And you need to really be prepared for that, because there's just no checks and balances. Boros and Celestia kind of check the 4-color greed piles in draft. That just doesn't exist in sealed. And you just end up in the spot where your opponents are really trying to cast everything from of any color of any cost.
Yeah. And that is what you should be prepared for. It's kind of interesting because it actually reminded me a little bit of Ixalan Sealed, in that, generally speaking, you're taking kind of the loose base of a guild. And in Ixalan, it would be like a tribe, right? Like a 2-color tribe. Here, it's a guild. And then you're building around that. You're trying to sort of use that as your base and then build the most powerful thing you can around that. That means, in this case, adding in some extra colors quite often. But I will note that I have had a couple of sealed pools, and Adam did as well, where the packs just broke in such a way that you actually could build a fairly streamlined 2-color deck. Now, I would say this probably happens 1 out of 10 pools or something like that, like just guessing. So it's not something that happens that often. And much like in Ixalan, occasionally you would just get, a Merfolk deck and you're like, oh, wow, I open up this. Do it. If that happens, go for it. These decks tend to perform quite well. As long as they're the good guilds. Like if you open what you think is a good Celestia deck, you're probably in trouble, because now you're trading off consistency for power. And the problem with that is that your opponents will be slightly slower than you, because Celestia is not particularly quick, and they'll be able to beat you anyway. But like, if you get a good Boros deck, or God forbid a good Izzet aggro deck, just make sure you check that box before you start slamming all the gates into your deck. Because if you get those decks, they are very well suited for the metagame that is sealed, because you'll find most people are doing what we're advocating for, which is they're going to stretch the greed a little bit. They're going to try to play as many colors as they reasonably can, and they're going to try to get the most power into their deck as they can. And if they do that, and you are the type of deck that can deploy a 2-drop into like a Cyclops and then start using Sonic Assaults on their stuff, they are not going to fare well, because, the mana bases can get pretty clunky when that happens.
Yeah. And I think that if your power is there, you can end up in 2 colors, because this is a pretty high powered format. Mm-hmm. So, one of the first seals I actually had was Dimir, that had Night Veil Predator and Disinformation Campaign, and just like all the good Dimir commons. And there I didn't need to stretch to a 3rd color, because I just had all the power I needed. If you have the power there, and it's not even just an aggro deck, like you said, aggro Izzet or Boros or something. Yes, if you have those, you can build them, but it can be a control deck too. As long as the power level is there, it's okay to be just 2 colors. Mm-hmm. But the key is that there's not that much of a drawback to playing more if you have the right fixing. Like, imagine you have a great Dimir deck, and you're like, oh, I have 23 great Dimir cards or 22 great Dimir cards, but you also have like 2 Golgari Guild Gates and like a status statue and an affection Indrik. You should still probably just splash those.
Definitely.
There's just not much of a drawback, because you're not really going to curve out on your opponent. Where that does change is when you do get that Boros deck. And sometimes you really can punish your opponent, but most of the time that's just not how it's going to end up playing out. What's going to end up playing out is you're both going to play powerful cards, and how you use your counter spells and how you kind of ration out your removal is really going to be what determines who wins.
Yeah, it's interesting. The gold card factor is so huge here. You know how, like, when you open up a sealed pool, usually the first thing you look at are your rares, right? Like, what are the sweet cards that I got? And they vary quite a bit in this set. There's obviously some pretty particularly strong bombs that you can open. Niv Mizzet comes to mind, for example. But
that's one I'll be stretching my mana base. And actually, that's a good one to mention specifically, because I mentioned how Niv might be the best card in the set. Mm-hmm. Niv is the kind of card that, if I had a Niv Mizzet, I would try really hard to either be Izzet or a very light splash, because it is worth being able to reliably cast that card.
Yeah, that card is just completely, especially in the metagame that we're in, where, as you mentioned, blue is the best color and all of the counter spells are highly playable. We like playing them in draft. Like, when it's very feasible that somebody sits down and goes, turn 1, mountain goblin, whatever it's called, or, healer's hawk off of a plains. And that's where, you look down at a card like Disdainful Stroke or Devious Cover Up and you're kind of like, right? Here, they're great. I mean, I play them in draft, even with that being the risk. Here, that is such a lower risk, and it's so much more, likely that our opponent's going to be trying to cast big, expensive cards to finish the game. So I want to have these counters. And Niv Miz, it's just like LOL. It doesn't care at all. So extremely. I mean, I think it is the best card in Sealed easily. It's the card I fear the most. The two cards that I think about the most are Inescapable Blaze and that, because I can't counter them and they're hard to interact with, so that's the thing. But going back to the gold cards, normally you look at the rares. You should do that here too. But then you look at the gold cards. Like when I sort my Sealed pool, I sort it by color. I take the cards that I don't think I'm likely to play and put them in a separate pile that I will review later. Then I put the gates and the lockets over to the left, and below the colors, I pile by guild. I just put all the gold cards by guild. And by the way, doing this reveals the true power of the guilds in a very obvious way. When you look at the gold cards, especially the commons that you get in Golgari, you're like, oh, Erstwhile Trooper and Undercity Uprising, they're just look so underwhelming. And then like you glance over to particularly the Dimir pile and you're just like, wow, like I get, Artful Takedown and, the, what's it called? The agent, the Darkblade agent and stuff. And you're just like, dang, these cards are good. And you kind of go through the blue ones and you're like, these are great. And, the one tempting thing that will happen, by the way, is that you'll see some good Boros cards because the gold cards in Boros are quite strong. But the problem with that is that you need to fill in all the other things that you need for an aggressive deck. And that's difficult to do when you don't get to choose any of the cards. You just have to have been handed them.
That's part of the reason that we emphasize so much Izzet and Dimir and Golgari, so like Sultai Grixis, is that look at the best, Boros and Celestia commons, right? Like Sky Knight Legionnaire and Rosemane Centaur. Like these are the kind of cards that just aren't that good in Sealed, and they're using their like premium slots on them. It's just not that powerful to be using your slots on these like aggressive creatures that reward curving out when the rest of the deck and the format don't really reward that at all.
Yeah. So look at these gold cards, look at your rares, and then you start to figure out if you can piece it together, because then the next thing you're going to want to do is, of course, look at your guild gates and decide, well, can I splash? And the answer is very often yes. I want to put a special emphasis on Gateway Plaza because it is such a fantastic mana fixer in these decks. It's a clunky card, and one that in average limited set wouldn't get a whole lot of attention. Effectively having to cast a land for 1 mana is just a bit much. But here it is. The hands that when I have an opener that has that card in it versus the ones that don't are so different. I just feel like if I have that card, I can just cast anything I need to. And if I don't, I have to kind of piece it together or hope to find what I need. By the way, one other thing to mention about the blue card, specifically Dimir, but also in general, is how powerful Surveil is when you're trying to find cards that you can cast or the cards to cast them, right? If you're sitting there, with your with a deck that doesn't have Surveil available to it, you do not have the ability to simply say, oh, well, there's a pretty powerful card on top of my library, but it costs double red and I have no red mana sources. I'll just put it in the bin for now. That's the kind of thing that, again, propels blue to be even better in this format, even though you do, of course, get it on black as well.
Yeah, it also synergizes really nicely with both Golgari and Izzet mechanics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so
totally.
I think that it is really important to note that the cross mechanic synergy is also really good, whereas Mentor and Convoke don't have that same thing going for them.
That's right. When it comes to those more niche archetypes that you can pick up occasionally if it's there, namely Aggro, Izzet, and straight up Boros, they are particularly tricky to get your hands on, like we said. It can happen if you hit this nice pocket of cards, especially the gold
if you
cards.
Have 2 Electromancers, 2 Piston Fist Cyclops, and a bunch of good Jumpstart cards, you can actually do that.
It can happen, and it has for me, but even then it felt like It felt like a draft deck that missed a little, right? Like where I'm just like, ooh, I really needed another Cyclops, or I really needed one more cheap spell and I just couldn't find it, or I'm only running 8 spells and I really wanted to be running 10, or, you are making compromises, but again, that can still be your best option. What happens way more often is like a more controlling Izzet version, to lean on cards like Hypothesis and stuff like that, mainly because it doesn't really need such a specific balance of threats and removal and stuff like that, like the Boros and Aggro Izzet versions do as well. Also, Boros is additionally less likely to work in Sealed because splashing in Boros is pretty precarious. It's not really where you want to be. You end up pushing yourself into a very mid-range Boros deck, which can win, but really needs some serious power level to make that work. Because you'll see like 2 Skyknight Legionnaires and a Boros Challenger and be like, okay, we're doing it. But then when you actually build out the pool, you'll realize that like you're short a few 2-drops, and the 2-drops that you are running are like a couple of Goblin Locksmiths and like maybe some Gravitic Punch that you didn't really want to play in the deck anyway. And these decks, you really need to kind of be good end to end to make these curve out decks work. It's really tough to just punt away a couple of critical slots, like a couple of good 2-drops being traded in for, basically the weakest 2-drop that you would run in that spot. These things all chip away at your ability to actually make Boros work.
Yeah, and the other thing is, it's not only that you're missing a beat, it's that your opponents have access to more rares and more removal than normal. So
great point.
They're going to have more powerful things to work with. So one thing I want to go over is kind of like what the skeletons of the main decks look like, or like what you should be focusing on. And it's I think almost all the best decks, or basically all the best decks, have a heavy blue base. So what you should be looking to do is, it's going to be highly dependent on which gates you get. Because if you have a mana base of a bunch of islands and Boros Guild gates, you can actually play basically Izzet splashing Luminous Bonds or Intervention Integrity, any of the good gold cards. But if the gates you happen to get are a bunch of Golgari gates, then you're better off playing the Golgari cards and the Dimir cards alongside them. So, like you said, Grixis and Sultai are like the 2 biggest ones, followed by Jeskai. So that would be Dimir splashing Izzet or Izzet splashing Dimir. Either way, though, it's more common to be Dimir splashing Izzet, which is basically because you get to put Deadly Visit, Dead Weight in your deck and then splash Hypothesis.
Yep, that's what it is. That is the name of that particular game.
And then for Sultai, it's often Dimir splashing green for like Affectionate Indrik and cards of that nature. But even
statue,
something
like you mentioned.
Yeah, status statue. Rhizome Lurcher is also a card that's a fine finisher.
It is.
In these decks. Another archetype which I've kind of liked in that same vein is Golgari splashing like Notion Rain and Chemister's Insight, where you're touching blue, and even Disdainful Stroke. You're touching blue for like all the good single blue cards, and you just happen to have a heavier green and black base of actual creatures. Golgari Finebroker and Izoni being kind of part of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are the top. Those are definitely the tops. What's it called? Is great too. The Lich.
Right, Underrealm Lich. The biggest reason to be Jeskai is like Deafening Clarion, and then followed by Pathcutter Giant. Those are both pretty solid reasons to splash white in these decks. And I found that you're less often that because a lot of the Boros cards are kind of blank, so you're not getting quite as much value. But there even are cards like Dawn of Hope. Like Dawn of Hope is I would stretch to play in almost any sealed deck. Just because it's the kind of card that you're really looking for that does end the game in the way that you're trying to do.
Yeah, that card is really one that you don't want to see on the other side.
Well, there's some decks that just can't beat it. You cast a Dawn of Hope and then they're just dead.
Yeah, namely all of the ones that I play. But yeah.
So I think if you start by laying out all your blue cards, it's kind of weird. This is the only format I've ever done it quite this way. Like, people like to make fun of us for liking blue, but we're not idiots. At least I don't think we are. We're going to play the decks that give us the highest win percentage. I mean, who's the person who registered 20 planes at the last Pro Tour, right? Like,
right.
I care a lot more about winning than I do playing all my favorite cards. But in this format, I think looking at blue and seeing what the fixing goes with your blue is the best. You just hope to open a bunch of blue guild gates because then you get to play all your sweet cards.
Adam started making fun of me because every time I would lead with like an island or a Dimir or is it Guildgate, and he'd go, "Oh, again, huh?" You know, he's just like, "Oh," and I'm just doing what the format's telling me to do. I'm not forcing it. I'm not just like, well, I'm going to play blue and figure it out from there. I'm just like, every build I had just kept on being that, and you know, like I said, he started teasing me about it.
Well, I mean, I think that's just the way you want to build decks in this format. And the other guiding thing that really changes where you want to pivot, because look, when we're talking, you know, is it splash black versus Dimir splash red? Like it's all pretty close. Like there's a lot of ways you can get there. The CCD cycle is a big part of that. Like Crackling Drake versus Nightfell Predator versus Golgari Finebroker. These are the cards that are really going to impact which direction you go. And you need to pay close attention because you really don't want to leave a Crackling Drake or a Nightfell Predator in your sideboard. These cards are great. So you need to stretch to try to play those as much as you can. We
should talk about the ones that go up in value versus draft, right? Because there's a lot of cards that kind of get ignored in draft. But when you change your mental outlook to, oh, well, I've got a lot more leeway here as far as timing and the things that I care about, it changes those values quite a bit. So like even a mediocre card like Color the Culprit, it just hits more relevant stuff and actually, you know, kills cards that you care about a lot more often in Sealed than it does there. So maybe it makes a main deck, maybe it doesn't. But I always note when I have Color the Culprit, and the times that I have main decked it, I've been actually quite happy with it. I've been like, all right, well, this is killing their bomb. Like this is killing the cards that I really care about, and that matters. Dawn of Hope we mentioned before. It's even better now. I like it in draft too, but it is a straight up bomb in this one. You and I like the counter spells a lot in draft, and they're somehow just even better here.
I mean, if you looked at the decks that I played at the last PT, I had double Devious Cover Up in my first deck and would have played many more counter spells in my second if I had them. Like, I think those cards are just good in draft. So it's no surprise that we're heavily going to advocate for them in Sealed.
Yeah. And boy, they are really good. I play all of them. Other cards, you know, Pilfering Imp or Never Happened, right? These just hand disruption cards. Look, Pilfering Imp isn't a great card. It's slow and it's not really a big priority. But I'll tell you what, when my opponent plays it against me, I'm always like, ugh, like that's kind of annoying. That's one of their ways to take away the big payoff card that I have while I'm kind of dirtling around, setting up my mana and, you know, using a removal spell here or there. And I like any way to get at that. And I know that I don't want to over correct for cards that are difficult to deal with, but I mentioned them before. Niv Mizzet and Inescapable Blaze are two cards that end a lot of games of Sealed when they get cast. And any way that I can get in there and take that card out of their hand so that my counter spells are still live, I'm usually pretty happy with it. So I'll play a Pilfering Imp in my main deck in Sealed, where in draft, I'm actually apt to not play it a lot of the time.
Yeah, I actually like it in draft well enough, depending on your curve. Mm-hmm. But in Sealed, I think it's a must play. Like if you're playing heavy black, it just deals with a lot of the cards that people are going to put in their decks that are going to be good.
Yeah. If you do end up in a green-based deck, Camaraderie is great. There's not a lot of sweepers in the format, and a lot of times the board does get stalled out because the blue decks can do a pretty good job of doing that with, you know, Wall of Mist and some other like high toughness blockers. And sometimes you have to kind of be patient and wait. And if you resolve a Camaraderie for 4 or 5 or 6 or whatever, the game can kind of just be over on the spot. So I like it even better than I do in draft. Another card that I think I've only actually got to play once.
I was going to ask you about this. When I saw this on the list and I'm just like, okay.
Yeah, so it's Mnemonic Betrayal. And that's the card that for 1 blue-black lets you play cards from your opponent's graveyard for the turn, and you can use any mana to cast them. And I have used this as a finisher. Look, it's not great. Okay, it sits in your hand for a really long time, and then eventually you get to 9 mana, and then you get to cast a big spell out of their library, or maybe 2 or 3 small spells. But I have found that is enough. Like you are absolutely doing it when you cast that card and you get to kind of go off. But boy, you better have the controlling deck to do it. But in draft, I don't even Like I don't usually even touch the card because it just seems way too inefficient to me.
Yeah, I guess thinking of the way that sealed games are going to play out, I think Mnemonic Betrayal makes sense.
Yeah, it's. I don't want to overstate it, right? I value it more, but not.
Think
I
of
don't
this
open
as
it
like
up and go. Yeah,
think of this similar to Invert Invent, which is like you're paying probably like 7 or 8 mana in this case, but you're getting to draw 2 to 3 cards.
Right, and by the way, I have that on the list too.
Yeah,
because
I like that card in draft also. So
I do too. I actually do too. I do. But here, I really like it. Again, think of things in terms of what's the absolute power level of a thing that I could do. Right? What's the high end? Like you dare to dream here, right? And Invent, specifically Invent, gives you the ability to draw 2 spells on your opponent's end step while still keeping up counter magic for their main phases. That's really powerful. I mean, you get to draw, a card draw spell and a counter, or, 2 removal spells or something like that on end step. And even though if you play it in draft, you know that it can be too slow sometimes, and that sometimes your opponent's running you over and you don't have that one turn to spend 6 mana to draw the removal spells. Here, you just kind of do. And you often have a really nice selection of cards to do it from as well.
Yeah, I went off yesterday in draft with Invert Invent, Double Devious Cover Up in my like Jeskai control deck that had Deafening Clarion and Justice Strike, where I'm inverting inventing for like Deafening Clarion and Resurgence Response counts as either instant or sorcery, and then a Devious Cover Up, and then shuffling back the Invert Invent and going from there.
Ooh, that is really nice. Wow, that covers a lot of bases too, especially with Justice Strike in there as well. The lockets.
Yeah, I think Is It and Dimir Locket are the 2 biggest ones because they're blue, but Golgari Locket also is playable. In fact, all the lockets are if you're of those color combinations, because at the end of the day, these do give you card advantage and they fix your mana.
That's right, and you do get a little more time to actually resolve them and not feel like you just drop kick to turn into the ether. So that's pretty good. Rhizome Lurcher.
Yeah,
you mentioned it before.
It's a card I don't mind splashing for, and it's just often going to be like a 6/6 or a 7/7.
It's always a 6/6 or a 7/7. I've never seen it not be. It's just a 4 mana 6/6, and that matters.
6 creature decks where I wouldn't want to play it, but But I think most of the time that if you're going to be in like Sultai, you're going to want a Rhizome Lurcher in your deck.
Yeah, again, a card that I'm not in love with in general, although I think it's totally fine, but I just think it's better. Flower Flourish, right? This is just what is the high end of things that I can do? Well, if the board gets stalled out and you unfortunately ended up in a Celestia deck, this is a good way to end the game. It does do that.
I almost just don't want to have these cards on the list. It's really hard to overstate how bad it is to put green cards in your deck, like green or white cards in your deck.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. No, you're right. You're right.
You're just dead money if you just have to play a Celestia deck. I just don't. It would take a Celestia precon to make me want to play Celestia.
The good decks that Adams built that didn't have blue in them were grossly overpowered just by pool, right? Like he had one with the Lich and Izoni in it, and then he also had Status, and God, if I remember correctly, he might have even had Finality in that deck. So okay, fine, right? Like I get it, sealed deck. I'll go down this route. But no, that's a good point. I don't want to encourage people to play those cards. So forget everything I said about Flower Flourish.
I know how Magic players are. I'm a Magic player. They are prone to hyperbole. But I feel like we tend to avoid that on this podcast for good reason. We're really trying to bring you accurate, measured responses. This is the most tilted towards blue format I've ever seen. Besides maybe like M14 draft or whatever. I think that you should be striving to play these like, the kind of decks that I would like. Which is funny. It makes me look biased, but that is, I think, the winning strategy. And I even talked to Michael Jacob, the person who plays the most sealed that I know. Like literally, no one plays more sealed than he does. And he says blue's by far the best, green's by far the worst. Like he just keeps track of all his stats. And I just think that this format, that's what's going on. Like the blue decks get to have all the best cards and the card draw and the counter spells, and the format's not fast, so card draw and counter spells are the best. It's really pretty simple once you look at just the cards available.
Yeah, it is. And speaking to that, another card that I really like that I still don't love in booster draft. I think it's playable, but I'm never really excited, but that I actually like quite a bit here is an Enhanced Surveillance.
Oh yeah.
Boy, man, because you'll bump into these other blue based decks and you're going to exchange a lot of resources. Yes, it is. And getting through your library to find your bombs is important, but it's really that activated ability. I know it sounds silly, but that is really important. The fact that you can get yourself so close to being decked, it happens all the time when you find somebody else who, say, has listened to this episode and kind of has figured out what to do in the format. You are going to start, it's going to happen a lot sooner than you think. How many cards are in your library? You're like, wait, what? And you pick it up and you've got 9 cards and you're like, oh my God, I have 3 power on board. Like, this crab is not going the distance. I have to find some way to win. And yes, you can do devious cover-ups if you get that going.
Well,
but
the thing is,
what I was
going to bring out is that the double devious cover-up is obviously the loop, but even the single cover-up is often enough to deck your opponent. Like, yeah, totally. Just one cover-up putting in 4 good cards back in your deck means you usually can finish them before you run out of cards. But it is a major concern. On that note, I would always main deck Drowned Secrets in this format. Assuming
would you? I was going to ask you, but I'm really glad you brought that up because I have yet to have one. But I keep thinking about it because I'm like, hey, if I'm kind of getting excited about enhanced surveillance and I'm playing all these blue cards, Drowned Secret seems really good.
Oh, it is great. I think that Drowned Secrets, if you're a blue-based deck, is just a fantastic main deck card, and I've conceded matches to it on turn 2 before.
How many blue cards do you think? I mean, because we have talked quite a bit about being base blue, but also splashing around a lot. I mean, is there a number
like 10-ish blue cards? I think it's fine.
Okay.
Which is less than half. So most of the time you're going to be more than that anyway.
Oh yeah. Okay. So yeah.
The thing is, if you mill 10 over the course of the game is often going to be enough.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and obviously you could draw this as one of your last blue cards, and that kind of sucks. But I think that in general, this card is definitely worth playing. It's the kind of card that can beat something like Dawn of Hope, right?
Mm-hmm.
Imagine you're playing like Jeskai Control, and they're playing Is It Control or Dimir Control. If you play turn 2 Dawn of Hope and they play turn 2 Drowned Secrets, like you probably feel like you're going to lose, and you probably
are going to race that, yeah. Especially if they start activating, start drawing extra cards. Never happened. We talked about Swath Cutter Giant. I like that one a bit too. Again, all of these things are just leaning on what's the most powerful thing I can do with this group of cards that I've gotten, where that isn't necessarily the case for draft. A lot of the draft decks are so heavily curve dependent and synergy dependent that you'll issue raw power level for synergy. Here, it's much more about raw power level. So a card like Swath Cutter Giant is just big and does a good job. Yeah. Also, if you can combo it off with Status Statue, kaboom.
Yes.
I did that once on stream, but my opponent conceded before I actually got to do it. So
I got to combo it off with Deafening Clarion. Just kills all their 3 toughness creatures, then attacks, kills all their 4 toughness creatures, and it has lifelink. So
we're
nice.
Really
in the money there.
And the last one I had was Glaive of the Guild Pact, which is a card that we've talked about on the show a bit. But I do find that if you are short on ways to win the game, if you're not, then don't bother. But if you are, look, you're often playing 4 or 5 gates in these decks. And that's kind of the line that, like you said when we talked about it last time, for it being worth it. You have random creatures laying around, and this thing does make them very threatening and can be a real problem for your opponent. So I actually like playing a Glaive as long as you're running at least 4 gates in your deck.
I actually added a Glaive above, earlier in this list, and then because it got cut off by the word the page jump.
That's really
definitely
funny.
Agree. I think Glaive of the Guild Pack is great in this deck or in this format. You just are frequently like the way you should be building your deck is when you take your like 6-ish gates that you should be, if you can, optimizing to play like 4 or 5 of them. So I think Glaive does end up doing the trick in that kind of deck.
Crushing Canopy is a card I actually main deck in draft as well, but I think I like it even more here. Did we talk about that during the show or off the air? I can't
we talked about it off the air.
Okay, so we should mention it here.
You should main deck Crushing Canopy. It does everything you want. It's the perfect sealed card. It just kills all the things you care about, like Capture Sphere, Luminous Bonds, Disinformation Campaign, and then just big flyers.
Right. So, now, I've been crushing a lot of canopies, but I haven't been crushing a lot of Contraband.
No, that's the 3 and a white version that kills an artifact or an enchantment or both.
Yeah, I just have it in the board. Also, I don't play white that much.
Yeah, it's just like you're white. You're not white very often, and you end up needing to kill flyers a lot more than you are needing to kill enchantments or artifacts. There's just not that many artifacts.
Right. Yeah. The trend here, of course, for the cards that go up a bit in value versus draft are that they tend to be slower, a little clunkier, perhaps not a lot of synergy with other cards in the format, but ultimately powerful. right? Just raw power. I think Swathcutter Giant's a great example of that. It doesn't even fit in the Boros deck, right? Your ideal Boros build, if I were to say, Luis, build me a B plus Boros deck just off the top of your head, it would never, ever have Swathcutter Giant ever, right? That's just not even a consideration because you don't want to play 6 drops. It just doesn't fit what the deck's trying to do at all. Yet, if I were to just read you that as just a magic card, like no context whatsoever, you'd be like, that's pretty powerful, right? Like it's big, It's got an ability, it's got another ability, it's reasonably costed. You don't feel like you're getting a great deal, but it's like, oh, that card has some punch to it, and I could see it being pretty strong. That's the kind of thing that you're looking for here in Sealed because you're leaning so much less on the synergies. So you can run cards like that.
Though, on that note, Arboretum Elemental has really disappointed me.
Oh, that card sucks.
It's the kind of card that looked to me like exactly what you would want in Sealed. And I was like, well, it's too slow for draft. Doesn't quite get there. It turns out the fact that green sucks is a big part of it. And the fact that there's just Hired Poisoner and Pitiless Gorgon at common is just like, okay, there's just a bunch of Death Touch creatures. I guess this just doesn't work.
I know. I also feel like it's a mana too expensive. Like it's 9 mana base cost. And I feel like maybe if it was 8, they probably didn't want to, mess around too much, but I don't know. It always feels like it comes down too slow. It also doesn't have quite enough toughness to, you can double block it or whatever. I'll tell you what, it's a telltale sign when a player plays a card against me and I feel relief. That is not good for that card, right? That when they play that, I go, oh, thank God. They just tapped all their mana in 3 creatures. That could have gone really poorly, but it was just a stupid Arboretum Elemental, so I didn't end up carrying it. It's like that is not a glowing review for a card like that.
No, definitely not.
Okay, let's get to the takeaways here for Sealed. Look, don't live under the threat of the fun police aggro decks or the synergy-based decks that you normally would in this format, and instead focus on leveraging the abnormally large amount of mana fixing. Again, the gates that you get, and then if you want the lockets as well. And you're guaranteed to get, by the way, in every Sealed deck, which is just very strange. And you leverage those to build the most powerful build you can within reason. This often stretches out to 3 or sometimes 4 colors. Don't be shy about that. But I did add within reason there, right? I mean, you don't want to be splashing double colored cards, if you don't have the tools to do so.
Yeah, if you're playing and you're just trying to jam a Night Veil Predator off 2 Dimir Gilgates and 2 Swamps, it's just not going to work. Like that's just not how math works. So don't do that. But if you have a Night Veil Predator, maybe build your deck blue-black and then splash red instead, so you can play that Predator. Because so here are the normal Sealed concepts we tend to go over, right? Because these hold true in almost every Sealed format. Try not to build aggro decks. Try to play all your powerful cards. Try to, maximize the amount of removal, make sure to main deck like artifact enchantment removal, and counterspells get a little bit better. In this format, because it's even more important that you do that. Here, in order to maximize your powerful cards, you should just be trying to flip your colors so that you get to play these like really high color intensity cards, and try to play as many counterspells as you can, because that's just really what this format is about.
We should mention too that I like this Sealed format, by the way. I've done a whole bunch of them against Adam.
There's a lot of play here.
It does suit my personal preferences, and that's probably why I like it.
This part's not for everyone, but like the gameplay of, we're going to both go through every card in our deck. So it's really important that you save your Disdainful Stroke for my Expansion Explosion, or you really make sure to use Devious Cover Up on my Fine Finality, because exactly which cards you're going to have to deal with. Like, they have a Gatekeeper Gargoyle that's going to come down as a 6/6 a lot of the time. So I've got to save my Luminous Bonds for that. Whereas I can, spew off my Hypothesis earlier, and just rationing card draw versus counterspells and when to tap out and when not to. That is intricate gameplay, and that's not for everyone. Some people really don't like that. But if you're into it, this Sealed format offers that, in spades.
Yeah, it's kind of all I want to do. So I've been having, it's a very Sigristian feel to it. But anyway, definitely give it a shot if you haven't. This Sealed format is way different than the draft, and that's a fun wrinkle, that really separates it out and makes it more interesting. And then also, if you happen to like the type of decks that we've been talking about, you're going to kind of be in heaven, I think, because you get the tools built in. We probably won't see this after the, Ravnica stuff is done, where you're just getting spotted all of this mana fixing. We're kind of just used to it. But
we have one more set of it, presumably.
Yeah, that's what I mean. So one more and then we're done. I mean, we go back to one that has like Evolving Wilds. Here you go. Right, it's like, and maybe some rare
if you're
cycle
lucky,
or something.
If you're lucky, you can splash 1 card or 2 cards or something.
Right, where you just don't even think about it that way. And here it's just like, well, which gates did I get? And is it 6 or 7? Did I open an additional? And you're also, I don't think I've ever had a sealed pool that didn't have at least one locket in it. So you're going to get those too. So anyway, spread your wings and fly, little birdies. This is actually a pretty cool sealed format. And if you like doing the long distance game, then you're going to enjoy it. All right, well, let's call it a show there. That's what we had for sealed. So let's just keep it nice and tight here and call it good. If you want to find us on social media, I'm Marshall_LR and Luis is LSV. We're always around on Twitter and elsewhere to say hi. If you want to find anything out about the show, we have all the links and stuff. Luis mentioned his stream earlier. You can find a link to that and a bunch of other stuff right on the front page of lrcast.com. I kind of just consolidated everything there when I made the site. So if there's anything that you want to find, our YouTube channel, our Facebook page, blah, 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 it's all right there. The subreddit, shout outs to the subreddit. We have a Discord if you're on the Patreon, blah, 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 blah. It's all there on that page. I also want to remind you that the show is brought to you by channelfireball.com. And since we're all about value today, I will remind you that you can get some value from Channel Fireball. And you can do this by selling your cards back to them. If you trade them in for store credit, you get 30% trade-in bonus, which is significant to say the least. It lets you keep on playing more and more Magic and gets those cards. Look, if you're playing them in a deck, that's one thing. But if they're sitting on your desktop and they're just not doing anything, well, get rid of them before they rotate. You'll regret it if you wait. Those standard cards really bomb out, but they're good for a year and a half. And if you send them into CFB, you can do that. And hey, if you don't want the 30%, you can also just get cash as a trade-in as well. Yeah. So make sure you check out that.
You didn't even mention the one of the new best items we have on sale right now.
What is that?
You can buy an Izoni the Thousand-Eyed and 499 LSV Beetle tokens. So that's 1,000 eyes if for those counting for only $1,000. So it's a
wow, only $1,000.
Yeah, it's a really good deal. It's a special limited time only item, and you got to snap them up while they're still in stock.
So what is that? $700 in trade in then?
Yeah, that's it.
All right, that's going to do it for this one. We'll see you next week.
So. I was talking to the Pro Tour champion, who's not me, unfortunately. That's Andrew Ellenbogen. He sent me
Bogan. He corrected BDM on the air, by the way.
That's fair. No,
yeah.
As someone whose name gets pronounced incorrectly 30% of the time, Lewis.
You're running 1 out of 3. Yeah. You get a lot of Lewis.
What's your last name? Scott-Vargas. Yeah. No, just your last name.
Oh,
Scott-Vargas.
Vargas. I saw somebody ask you that once too, and I was like, "Oh, they think his name's Scott."
Yeah,
like this probably gets old if you're. Anyway, carry on.
In any case, Andrew Ellenbogen messaged me because we had done a split in the finals of the Pro Tour, right? Like we're talking about how it's a very big prize difference. So he's like, "Hey, you remember I owe you for the split," and I looked, and it was on Facebook Messenger. He had sent me a message 5 years earlier saying, I love your draft videos, and I drafted a deck I thought you might like. Like me and my buddy drafted this deck I thought you might like.
Oh, that's cool.
So literally 5 years ago. So I thought that was really funny because.
Oh, that's great. That's really funny.
Yeah, he went from dude who had never gone to a Grand Prix and was pretty casual and was just excited to show me this draft deck to beating me in the finals of the Pro Tour just a couple years later.
That is incredible. I have something to mention on your sign-off too here, Luis.
Yeah, what's that?
I just had to say thank you. I got this great letter from Aaron Landis, and Aaron put together a 15-card pack of every elk ever printed in Magic. These are the true elks, the actual Elmers, and they're all in foil as well. And there's one called Sacred White Deer. I don't even know what set this is from, honestly. What would the set be? GS1 printed this year.
I have no idea.
Maybe this is the the APAC set. I don't even know, but he put a note that says the only one not printed in foil, and another one called Hidden Stag that is an enchantment. But anyway, I just wanted to say thank you for that because I thought that was really cool.